All right. Welcome back, folks. Welcome back to our Economic Policy Conference. I hope you had a chance to grab a sandwich because we are going to have an absolutely tremendous lunch conversation featuring my friend, the former Chief Justice of Delaware and now at Wachtell-Lipton, Leo Strine, discussing an issue. There's really no more important issue, as we learned this morning, than the future of the American worker. And he'll be discussing it with Richard Trumka, of course, the president of the AFL-CIO. I want to thank both of you for being here today and for discussing these important issues. Welcome to our conference, and please, Leo, take it away.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you, Ed and NYU, for sponsoring this important event. This is a really special session for me to get to interact with a person I consider to be an example of what good citizenship and leadership is in our world. President Trumka comes from Western Pennsylvania, something I have an affinity for. My father-in-law is from there. My great-grandmother is from there. And he has never forgotten where he came from. He had the opportunity to go to law school. But what he did with his formidable brain was to help the people he grew up with and the people in his community and the people he worked alongside of as a minor. And I differ with him in my choice of football teams. He loves the Pittsburgh Steelers, but as a Baltimore kid whose grandfather started working when he was 9, and thanks to unions and the printers union was able to live a solid middle-class life. I'm a hometown guy like him, so I was a Baltimore Colts fan growing up, and until the jerk moved them to Indianapolis, Mr. President, and loved the Eagles and the Colts, but my wife loves the Pittsburgh Steelers. And President Trump also exemplifies, though, I think, the best of the union movement. He embraces the need for us to protect all workers. Therefore, he supported immigration reform for a long time and fair treatment of those among us who have come from other places, recognizing that almost all Americans have family members who came from somewhere else. He has been a champion of racial inequality. He has been an internationalist who has recognized that the American workers need to join arms with working people in all regions of the world and move forward together on common principles. And this is a very important time for the labor movement, because a lot of the things that President Trump has been leading on for a long time and that have frankly not been given as much weight as they should be are being taken seriously. So it's an honor to be with you, President Trump. And there's a big event kind of for those of us in Delaware and some of us whose first political hero is a guy named Joe Biden. There's a kind of big thing coming up in a month. And I thought I'd start really by giving you an open-ended question, which is, why does this election matter so much for Americans in general and working people in particular? Mr. President, I think you got to unmute.
There we go. First of all,
you usually don't even need a microphone to be heard, sir, but I think on this platform you do.
I'll always take a megaphone no matter where. First of all, let me thank NYU for sponsoring this event. And let me thank you for your friendship, but for your years of service to this country. The country's a better place because of your efforts and the things that you believe in and things that you fought for. So I want to say thank you for that on behalf of workers. Let me start off by saying, you know, most workers right now believe that neither the economy nor the political system works for them. And so they're looking for bold change. That led them in the last election somewhat to Donald Trump, because he said he was going to change the rules of the economy. Because here's what we've been told, Leo. We've been told that the economy is like the weather, that there's nothing you can do about it. You're just a victim, and no matter what happens, it's there. But the economy is not like the weather. The economy is nothing but a set of rules, and those rules decide the winners and the losers. And for the last several decades, workers have been the losers. Those policies have led to a growing inequality in this country. And when I talk about inequality, I talk about three aspects of inequality. There's inequality of wealth and wages. There's inequality of opportunity. And mostly there's inequality of power. Now, that inequality has continued to grow, and I'll come back to all of those. That inequality has continued to grow to where it actually threatens the American system of capitalism and democracy, because more and more millennials equate the system of American capitalism with democracy. When they were asked how important is it to live in a democracy, only 30% said it's important to live in a democracy. 70% said it's not, and 24% said it's bad to live in a democracy. So as inequality grows, we are on a trajectory towards implosion of the American system of capitalism and democracy. Things that help that system slow down are good. Things that increase the trajectory are bad. And this election is about whether that trajectory will be increased towards implosion, because President Trump believes that corporations should be stronger, that workers should be weaker, that our wages are too high. He's appointed an NLRB that is filled with union busters. He's destroyed OSHA and MSHA, the agencies that protect us. And then you have Joe Biden, who believes that we need to rebalance that inequality of power so that we can fix the other systems. That's what this election is all about. So it is a watershed for workers. And you'll hear me refer back today to those things that I said and the three inequalities that led us here.
And Mr. President, I think that's a great segue to next year, because this year has really underscored some of that inequity in our economy for people who just didn't recognize it before. And a couple of the dimensions of those, as you know, are that the people we define as essential to the economy actually get paid less than average. My wife is an occupational therapist at a children's hospital, and even the worker, highly skilled workers like nurses, therapists, they actually don't get paid that much more than the median wage. But I think of the people who clean the hospitals during this time, who do the most important work to keeping those patients safe, the people who work at the grocery stores and others who have kept us together. And it's actually a great word, essential, because we may have recognized them. And then when you look at the fact that essential workers are a person of color is much more likely, Black person is much more likely to be an essential worker, that also shined a light on that continuing racial inequality. So next year could be an opportunity to really come out of this pandemic in a way that puts workers first. And I was wondering what you think are the most important things that a new president and Congress could do to help working people.
Well, the first thing I think we have to understand is that we face three intertwined crises right now. A public health crisis, an economic crisis, and a crisis of racial justice. And the lack of worker voice and worker bargaining power is a common thread that runs through all three of those. Now, you can't fix the economy until you fix the public health crisis. And that means you're going to have to do several things. One, you're going to have to pass an OSHA standard, a mandatory OSHA standard that can be enforced by workers if OSHA won't enforce them. Because, Leo, here's what's happened during this crisis. OSHA has been AWOL. They've been completely gone. This president has gutted OSHA. There are fewer inspectors out there now than at any time in its history. This OSHA has issued 4 violations since the pandemic began. Four. And then on September 10th, they issued the 5th one that 8 people died 1,300 people got infected, and they issued a fine of about $14,000. So actually there are now 6, both of which are along those lines. So you have to give workers more power, and again, that means passing the PRO Act. So if we fix the virus, the coronavirus, then you can start fixing the economy. In order to do that, you really do have to pass the PRO Act. And let me explain the PRO Act to people out
Yeah,
there.
that would be great, because I know, I understand that a lot of people think it's transformational, and that Mr. President would bring labor law into the 21st century and really make the promise of the National Labor Relations Act real in a new century. And so I think everybody would love to hear why you think it's so important and what it involves.
Sure. Our labor laws that we currently labor under, no pun intended, were written in the 1940s. And then they were modified in the 50s again to weaken them even further. So we're under a system that is so antiquated it doesn't exist or doesn't help workers in today's economy. And that's one of the reasons why you're seeing the imbalance of power between employers and employees. The PRO Act would change that. It would modernize the act. It would modernize the economic weapons that employees have, and it would rebalance again the level of power between employers and employees, so that we could share equally the benefits of the society and of our economic system, and actually decrease that trajectory towards implosion, rather importantly. So by doing that, you'd allow workers to have the power to negotiate for better PPE on the job, for better health and safety standards, for sick days. Because remember, without them, sick workers went to work because they couldn't do anything. And then in addition to that, you have to fix the other 2 as well. And we would need to invest in infrastructure, significant investment in infrastructure, and significant investment in bringing society, the third crisis, under control, and that's the racial injustice in this country.
How do you think a living wage fits in with this, President Trump, if it does? I mean, is that part of the agenda as well, to sort of set a fair floor under bargaining for everyone?
Absolutely, because look, right now we have people in this country that work full-time and still live in poverty. That's not the way to reward workers. You should be able, if you work full-time, you should not be in poverty. You should be able to lift yourself out of poverty, and a living wage would start to do that. It would start to escalate things up. If you look at right now, if you took 1968 wages and you adjusted them for productivity and inflation, the minimum wage would be over $20 right now in the United States. So going to a living wage would help do that. It would set a floor for people with a union and those without a union. So even if you didn't have a strong voice, at least you would have the ability to live outside the poverty level and provide your family with the minimums of a good life.
President Trump, I was also interested in your views about closing the racial inequality gap, because one of the things I think that's most anguishing actually about what exists is that in many ways black people really didn't get the right to participate in the economy freely until the 1960s. And it was a fairly brief period of time until you had the reversal in the way we were doing business that turned against workers. And a thought experiment I have in my mind is how much more equality we would have if workers simply got the same share in the 2000s and in the 1990s as they got in the previous 3 decades, because black people are much more likely to be in the working and lower middle class and could have been, much more economically secure, gain much more wealth. And so can you explain how labor's agenda will help close that equality gap that still persists in our society?
Well, more than any other demographic group, African Americans have backed union organizing in their workplace. They know that a union contract where workers who do the same work, they get the same wages, and there's transparency. So you can see there's no discrimination. And there was a Princeton study not too long ago, Leo, that found out those who benefited most from the post-World War World War II system of collective bargaining was using new available data, was low-skilled workers and workers of color. So look, our belief is this. The labor movement has always been a champion for racial justice. We've not always acted as well as we should have. It's our job to be at the tip of that spear, not in the middle of that spear. And so we're pushing out right now to make sure that those racial injustices, the structural things that are out there, get changed, whether it's in policing or whether it's on the job, whether it's in education or anywhere else in society, to make sure that our system truly does become colorblind, where people get the same opportunity no matter what you look like, where you come from, who you love, or who you worship. That's our mantra right now, and we're working hard at that.
I assume part of what you're also saying is that if you treat everyone fairly, and there's the ability for everyone to provide for their family and have hope for their children, that's going to reduce economic insecurity for everyone, including struggling white workers, but will have a disproportionately beneficial effect on Black Americans in particular, because they're still climbing that economic ladder because of past discrimination. But it's a way to bring us all together and to eliminate the ability to people to exploit economic insecurity, by pointing to immigrants or other people as the cause of their pain, and address the real issue, which is are they getting a fair paycheck?
Well, it will help whites as well that are struggling in the lower class or working class. It'll help whites as well. It'll look, it all comes down to power. And the inequality of power is at the genesis of all the inequalities in the country that we have right now, and the inequality of opportunity as well. So balancing that power, giving people a real voice on the job will help Black workers, brown workers, white workers, and every worker out there.
Now, as you know, the Business Roundtable issued an important statement, which I think was a good move forward to recognize that businesses, I don't, it's sort of surprising in 2019 that we needed to recognize this, because it's kind of the old time religion that beat Hitler and beat Stalin, but and made us proud of our nation and set an example for the world, but kind of recognize that companies are about more than just profits, and they have to treat their workers and everyone fairly. Some would say, and the institutional investors, the people who have the big money and put pressure on the companies, are increasingly recognizing this. And some would say, President Trump, let them just have some time to do this on their own, and that there's no real need for new legislation like the PRO Act or a living wage or other things. What's your answer to that basic question?
Well, first of all, we tried that for decades. We tried deregulating the industries for short term. We gave them every opportunity that was out there. And quite frankly, it didn't work. We tried deregulating our market capitals. We created rules that favor short-termism, and then we act as if some kind of magic Wall Street wasn't going to do just exactly what we were asking them to do, and that's get control of companies and run them into the narrow short-term interest. The financialization of the U.S. economy is the result of the way that we regulate business. And we need to regulate them more, I think. Because look, we need a comprehensive public policy approach to drive long-termism in this country, and a corporate economy that respects the people who create the wealth. Passing, a financial transaction tax might help with a little bit about that. But really, the best way to do that is to equalize the power between employers and employees, and then you will negotiate what is best for both parties. I don't believe that the altruism without the power behind it will ever succeed, because you know better than anybody, Leo, they have an obligation to maximize shareholder value. That's what their fiduciary duty is. And they've started talking about bringing in the other stakeholders because they realize that the system right now is on a trajectory to implosion if it continues the way it is, and only benefits a very small band at the top of the economic stratosphere. Look, you remember the old
and along that lines, Mr. President, I think some folks on the left of the political spectrum, because they were living in some sort of New Deal mantra, which I love the New Deal, but never really kind of understood, for example, that managers versus stockholders was an old trope, and that the stockholders now are actually huge financial institutions who put enormous pressure on companies. Is the labor movement recognize now that, frankly, part of the answer has to also be to hold institutional investors accountable for voting their shares in a way that's aligned with the interest of America's workers and worker investors, so that they don't inadvertently hurt the people whose money are going into the 401k accounts that they manage?
Well, we've known that for a number of years. Back in the early 90s, I started a program in the AFL-CIO called the Capital Stewardship Program, where we organize our capital like we organize workers, and we started trying to reform corporations through the shareholder proxy process. Of course, you know as well as I do that a proxy vote is just, it's a guidance. It's not mandatory on managers. And so we would pass a number of those things that we thought would be good for shareholders, good for the company, good for the community over the years. And they were just disregarded by management because they could disregard those things. So
but they can't disregard Fidelity, BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard. Correct. And I guess what I'm really kind of pressing on is it time for those institutions to also have an obligation to disclose how they take into account fair treatment of workers, environmental protection, and others, and to align their perspective with the long-term interest of the workers whose capital they hold?
It is, but disclosing it's not enough. How do you get them to change?
So should their fiduciary duty really be, Mr. President, instead of almost the opposite of what the new Trump Labor Department is suggesting, is that you actually have a duty to look at who your investors are, and if they're working people saving for retirement, that you need to be looking at that long-term perspective and realize that what they're going to get to save for retirement is going to depend on them having access to a good job. They breathe air, they do other things, and that there should actually be an affirmative duty for them to think about these things and to align their stewardship activity, as the word is, whatever, with the real people they represent. Is that what you're saying?
Go back to the Business Roundtable's new vision of America with the stakeholders. To give that real meaning, that should become the fiduciary duty of those corporations and shareholders and board of directors. Their fiduciary duty is to the workers, to the community, to the shareholders, and to the corporation itself. Then you would have some real teeth, and you'd have the ability to enforce it and make it a reality.
Can I ask a little bit about power within the corporation? I know it's really important to the labor movement that things not be substitutes for the PRO Act or a living wage, right? And so I think we accept that. But as you know, there's been some talk about workers on boards in the US. And I guess my own view is I'm not sort of against that, but what I point out to people is, and our friend Damon pointed out on an earlier panel, is in Europe, as you know, workers on boards is just part of an overall system that starts with works councils at every large company that consult on important issues like family-friendly scheduling, worker safety, and that there's a much stronger union component, and both the works councils and the union provide a source of information up and a source of candidates, and then there's information down. what steps could we take within corporate America and in American context that might help and work with the PRO Act, Mr. President? Something like a required board committee like the UK has just done to focus on the workforce. Do you have any ideas along that line, particularly given the fact that for many companies, even after the PRO Act, it's going to be a decade or more before unions can really get in there?
Well, I believe that if you look at Europe and you look at Asia, as Damon, I'm sure, told you, the very foundation of those systems was collective bargaining. It was built on collective bargaining and workers having the power so that they come to the table as equals with an employer. If you stick a token employee on a board, nothing will change. If you have an equal number of employee representatives and employer representatives on the board, then you start to come to a different culture and things change. So we would look at something along those systems, but it's not a substitute. Anybody who says that you can do that and it's a substitute for the power of workers, I think, is mistaken, and I violently disagree with them, because there is no substitute for having an equal level of power between employers and employees. That's when the best decision gets made. That's when partnerships are truly are possible, because then it's not a co-option, it is a real cooperation. And so we would want to see that type of power ingrained into the corporate charter or into the corporate laws so that there was real teeth and workers had real power.
Is there any room, given that private sector unionization has fallen to such lower levels in the U.S., is there room to, but there's growing interest, as you know, among new workers and the new generation in unions. There's, I think the polling data around unions is more favorable than it's been for a long time. Is there any interest in the labor community of allowing businesses with the right structure to experiment with forms of worker voice at companies without unions? Are there safe structures that you might be willing to trust and use that as a building, a kind of bridge to, greater unionization?
Well, I've said for years, Leo, that all workers ought to have the right to collectively bargain with their employer. Well, you have a union or you don't. You ought to have the right to collectively bargain. It's almost like electing a public official. We elect who's going to be our official, but we don't elect whether we'll have an official or not. In the system of industrial democracy, the election's about whether you'll have a voice or you won't have a voice. So every employee out there, union or non-union, ought to be able to bargain to get a fair share of the wealth that they produce. We'd be willing to look at that and experiment with that. But I'm not for fake voices.
Right.
I'm not for management-dominated unions. I'm not for fake participation in committees where everybody knows that the boss is listening, and if you say anything they don't like, that they'll come after you. I'm not for any of that. But I think the law could be, we could do a number of different things to experiment with that, and the forms of unionism. We've talked about looking at the forms of unionism to make them more malleable and flexible. For instance, Leo, the labor union used to go to young workers that are in the gig society, and we would say, here, come and join us. And they would say, you're great people, but that really doesn't work for us. And we would say, yeah, we know, but come and join us anyway. Our approach is completely different now. Our approach is we go to workers and we say, what do you need us to be? What do we need to be to meet your needs? And then we become that. We become what they need to meet their needs. And the laws, quite frankly, in the country are a real impediment to doing some of that, because it's the way they're inflexible. There is no, you're either union or not union. There's no flexibility in between them, and would be willing to look at things like that along the way.
No, and I know it's also very frustrating for a lot of workers. I know the healthcare space very well just because of my family, of highly skilled workers, but are not management. There's so many barriers that, as you know, that treat them where you can have like everybody's supposedly a manager and they don't have any voice, when they actually, just because you have a master's degree in nursing doesn't mean that you're actually a manager, and they would want a different form of voice probably than someone at a different at a tech plant or something like that. One of the things that's interesting is your perspective
and we've
on
done that. We've
Yeah.
modified things for professionals, whether they're doctors, lawyers, other groups, that we've put things together along those lines.
No, it's interesting for some of our academic listeners. One of the places where I always love some of my conservative friends who are professors who have absolute tenure and who have very strong, usually union rights, by the way, Mr. President, and can't get discharged, but they don't necessarily want it for everyone else. But I think that it'd be interesting, your reflections on the pandemic, because I think a lot of Americans don't realize that the Works Council system in Europe involves workers consulting on things like safety, like family-friendly schedulings, for example, is a thing. And whether this system, where workers actually have more accountability in some ways, Mr. President, right? Because they actually have to have an ownership in how the company is run. Whether that's played a role for some of the nations that have done better in the pandemic, in terms of the resiliency of their companies and their ability to keep things going safely during this. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think they've had not only a greater voice because things are ingrained into the system, they've had a greater effect because their voice has to be heard. So when it came to creating PPE, they said, here's what we need. They didn't have to negotiate for sick days and come to work because they didn't have them. They didn't have to go through all of those things because their culture provides for all of that. And the union voice actually gives the opportunity for a union management investor partnership to become a reality. Because you can't ignore them, those European companies and European countries have dealt with unions and actually embraced them and treat them like assets to be invested in rather than costs to be cut, as we do in this country. And so that power, that voice, puts a worker up in front and says, here's what we need for health and safety. And our experience has been, most employers want to do what's right by their employees. Many small employers don't know what to do or how to do it. When you have a union there, we will tell you how to do it. We have training courses that we provide for employers and employees, union and non-union, by the way, to help with the pandemic. So again, it's the power of workers having a voice that can't be ignored. That ends up making us make better decisions.
Some suggest, though, that if workers have more voice, companies will not deliver profits for society. Does that make any sense to you? Does any worker want to work at a non-profitable company?
Well,
Does that help them? Does that help their families?
That's the most ludicrous thing I've ever heard. That's like saying I have a golden goose and I'm going to kill him tomorrow so I get the last golden egg. Look, employers know that their employees know that their employers have to be profitable. And look what happened after World War II. When we were powerful, everybody in that industry would get a wage increase. The unprofitable people couldn't compete in that system because they couldn't drop wages. They had to compete by productivity, by ingenuity. It forced everybody upward rather than forced us downward to the lowest standard. And workers want that. And when we get
but some say that the real issue is just training, and that the American worker, the only reason the American worker is not getting the same share is they're just not as trained, as educated as workers were in the 50s and 60s. How do you react to that, Mr. President?
Well, a little bit of that may be partially true, but it's the symptom, not the cause. In the 60s and 70s, companies invested in their workforce because workers had bargaining power and could demand wage increases. Companies had to drive productivity or they'd find themselves unable to compete in the labor markets where wages were set through collective bargaining across the entire industry. And unions understood that this dynamic supported and in many cases sponsored worker training programs. Here, this is the best kept secret in America, Leo. Other than the US military, we still train more people every single year than anybody else out there. Our apprenticeship programs are the world's envy. We put out the most skilled people, and then we bring our people back and we retrain them on new methods, on new materials, so that our employers are always the most productive, and thus we can get a better wage.
And again, I'd love you to talk about the potential win-win for business and our whole nation if bringing together the power of that insight in terms of the training of workers and infrastructure and addressing climate change, and how that can create not only more prosperity for the United States in terms of quality jobs, but make our companies more internationally competitive and also address this existential threat that's facing us all. How does that all come together in your mind in an integrated way?
First of all, I think everybody has to come to grips with climate change as a reality. It's real. The science supports it. Not pretend it doesn't exist, and so we address it head on. And then we both, as a society, we have to make the decision that in curing the problem of climate change, we're not going to jettison people and leave them behind. We're not going to let coal communities die in Appalachia. We're not going to let oil companies die in Oklahoma. That we are going to make sure that the new jobs that are created, and there will be millions, will be two things. One, they'll be available to those workers that are losing their jobs, and to those communities, so that the benefits of the new job is shared with the community as well. And two, that those jobs will be good paying jobs. That means that workers will be able to have a voice on the job to make them good paying jobs with good benefits. Because look, the good paying jobs that we have today, they weren't good paying jobs when my grandfathers went into the coal mine, or my dad went into the coal mine. The United Mine Workers made them good paying jobs, or the OCAW made their good paying jobs, or the steel workers made them good paying jobs. And if we have the right to do that, we can provide training, we can provide skills, we can provide the highest skilled workforce in the world, and we will take on the competition and knock their socks off if all of us are working together. And by that I mean workers, management, and investors.
And you know, that's a good bridge to the last part of our time together, which it's been great to have you share these perspectives, is the international one. From the beginning of your presidency, you've recognized the need to address the needs of American workers within the context of a global economy, and also, frankly, to support working people throughout the globe. Can you tell us what you're hoping for from a potential new administration in terms of making real the promise of the post-war trading regime, which it was FDR's vision, as you know, Mr. President, to really that worker rights and the other things in the New Deal would be part of the world trading regime. And that didn't happen, and mobilized capital has really been put first. Do you have some things that you would like to see from a new administration on the international front that would help American workers and all workers?
Right. We could talk all day on this one because I really have a lot to say. But look, one of the greatest lies that racists tell is that American workers, our enemies are the Mexican worker or the Chinese worker, because nothing could be further from the truth than that. Our fate with working people is bound together. And look what happened when we came together with the Mexican workers on the USMCA. We were able to negotiate a contract that is going to allow them to raise their wages so that they can become consumers of our products, and their standard of living will grow. And we're going to be able to do the same on our side. Our standard of living can grow. But It's not an accident, for instance, Leo, that the biggest supporters of like the Chinese government's repression of Chinese workers in recent years is the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in China, because they benefit from those low wages elsewhere. So here's what we want. We'd look for the Biden administration to do. We want them to look at all their trade agreements through the lens what would be good for worker power and our wages. What would be good there? We also want them to make fundamental changes in the ways that they handle trade policy. We'd like for them to reassert their role as first among equals in international institutions, like the Paris Climate Accord, like the IMF, like the OECD. All of those things that have an effect on international trade and international workers and international wages and international cultures should be thought about, and we should reassert ourselves. And then we want to see President Biden address things like currency manipulation that we haven't seen for a while. And then instead of trying to do things unilaterally, do things multilaterally in trade. Look, you can't dry up the overcapacity of steel in China by us simply putting tariffs on them. It takes the entire trading community, our European allies, or our Japanese allies around the world, all coming together to say, you're going to play by the rules, and all of us are going to make sure that you do that.
And so I take it one of the things you're saying is that whether people like it or not, we need to join arms with our OECD counterparts who share our values, and to try to take the common things that we care about in terms of workers and make that part of the entire global system.
I don't think that we can correct the problems of the world or have trade that really benefits everybody unless we approach it from that multilateral point of view. Going it alone, being John Wayne riding on a horse shooting at people is fun to watch and listen to, but it's totally ineffective in today's
Just
world.
because we have talked a little bit about what the business community can do, many times sometimes companies treat their direct workers well, but don't necessarily have standards for their contractors. And many of those contractors are actually involve foreign workers. Would it help if one of the commitments of the BRT was to make sure that their employee standards and how they treat workers were extended in a regionally appropriate way to all their workers, international or American, and that they require their contractors to adhere to those same kind of standards?
You know, I agree with that 100%, but we ought to bring it back a little more closely. Take a look at Amazon right now. Jeff Bezos has accumulated the world's largest fortune at Amazon. He's done that because he's got great employees, and those drivers, those Amazon drivers, he's got a legion of lawyers in court saying that they're not his employees. So as long as he doesn't take responsibility for them, he can deny anything he wants. So we ought to take responsibility for you and the supply chain that you just talked about, Leo. You should have a responsibility for that up and down the supply chain so that we can help raise the standard of living, not just here in this country, but literally around the world. And we could be the leaders in doing that, rather the leaders in dragging down labor standards around the world, because that's what we do now.
Mr. President, it's been an honor for us to hear from you and to be with you, and that's a great note on which to end this, and we're so thankful for you for sharing your time so generously with us. Back to you, Robin. Thank you, Mr. President.
President Trump let me join Leo in thanking you for those incredibly thoughtful remarks about the future of the American worker. I think all of us have gotten some insight on what may lay ahead, and it's very exciting to hear you give us a framework for thinking about that. And of course, thanks to my friend, Chief Justice Leo Strine. For those of you who haven't yet had an opportunity to read Leo's recent work on just these subjects, I commend it to you. It's incredibly thoughtful, and I think gives us a roadmap for where we might be headed, where I hope we're headed in the future. Thanks again to both of you. And we'll now turn, after a 10-minute break, to our next subject on corporate resilience. And in particular, how after a decade of economic growth, so many corporations, as well as the economy writ large, in many ways were unprepared for the COVID-19 crisis and what we can do about that going forward. We'll be joined by an esteemed group of panelists on that subject at 1 p.m. Eastern. We'll give you 15 minutes to grab some coffee, and we'll see you at 1 o'clock. Thank you.